The afternoon heat pressed down on the cracked asphalt of Sullivan's auto repair like a punishment from somewhere above the kind of San Diego summer that turned metal too hot to touch and made the air shimmer in waves off every surface. Jack Sullivan stood in the open bay door, a blue shop rag in one hand and a socket wrench in the other, squinting against the glare, while sweat traced slow lines down his temples. The neighborhood sat quiet around him, that particular silence of people, too busy surviving to make unnecessary noise, too focused on getting through another day to waste energy on anything that did not directly contribute to that goal. He had been working on Mrs. Chen's Honda Civic since dawn broke orange over the eastern hills, replacing a timing belt that should have been changed 2 years ago when the warning signs first appeared. She could not afford it, then could barely afford it now, and Jack had learned long ago that some bills simply never got sent. The invoice would show labor and parts it cost nothing more, and Mrs. Chen would pretend not to notice, while he pretended the gesture meant nothing. They had performed this dance 7 times over the past 4 years, ever since her husband passed and left her with a car that seemed determined to fall apart piece by piece. The garage itself stood as a monument to making do with less than enough. Concrete floors spider-webbed with cracks that had been there when his father first signed the lease in 1987. Fluorescent lights overhead that flickered when they felt like it, casting the workspace in intermittent strobes during the humid months when the old wiring protested the load. Walls covered with calendars from part suppliers stretching back to 2015, none of them ever taken down, because taking them down would mean admitting time kept moving forward, whether he wanted it to or not. The waiting area consisted of 3 mismatched chairs salvaged from an office liquidation sale, a coffee maker that only worked if you struck it precisely on the left side at a specific angle, and a collection of outdated magazines his late wife Lisa had organized before she got sick. 5 years since the cancer took her, and those magazines still sat in their little wire rack edges yellowed covers, featuring celebrities who had since divorced, and politicians who had since resigned. He kept meaning to throw them out. He kept not doing it. Jack was 38 years old, though some days the mirror showed him 60. Tall and lean in the way of men who worked with their bodies rather than behind desks, with dark hair just starting to show threads of gray at the temples, and hands that bore the permanent stains of a man who had spent his entire adult life fixing things other people had broken. His daughter Lily told him he needed to smile more, that his face had settled into something too serious for someone not yet 40. Easy for a 14-year-old to say. She had not watched someone she loved waste away over 18 months. She had not stood in hospital rooms that smelled of antiseptic and defeat-making promises to people who could no longer hear them, hoping those promises somehow mattered anyway. The Civic's timing belt replacement was nearly complete, just the final tensioner adjustment remaining, when Jack heard something that did not belong in this neighborhood. An engine sound that spoke of money in amounts he would never see, a low, powerful purr that seemed to come from another world entirely. He straightened, wiping his hands on the rag more from habit than necessity, and watched as a white Rolls-Royce Phantom glided down the street like some misplaced aristocrat wandering through the wrong part of the city. The car turned into his lot, moving with the cautious precision of someone absolutely terrified of encountering anything that might scratch that pristine paint. It came to rest near the garage entrance, and for a long moment nobody emerged. Jack could see 2 figures behind the tinted window silhouettes, engaged in what looked like an intense conversation, hands moving in gestures that suggested disagreement. Then the rear door opened, and the first woman emerged into the brutal afternoon light. She was probably mid-40s, though she had clearly spent a fortune ensuring nobody could pin down the exact number. The cream-colored pantsuit she wore probably cost more than Jack's pickup truck, maybe more than everything in his garage combined. Dark hair pulled back in a severe style that somehow managed to look both intimidating and elegant, every strand precisely positioned. Everything about her, from the way she held herself to the quick, dismissive glance she cast around the garage with barely concealed distaste, broadcast wealth and power in frequencies Jack rarely encountered and never sought out. But it was the second person who made Jack forget about the heat, about the grease on his hands, about the half-finished Civic waiting behind him for its final adjustment. The girl who stepped out of the Rolls-Royce, moved like every inch of motion, cost her something precious, something she could never get back. Young woman, really maybe 19 or 20, with her legs encased in elaborate braces that ran from her hips all the way down to her ankles. Metal and composite materials formed a complex exoskeleton, the kind of advanced medical engineering that screamed expensive in ways Jack could barely quantify. Joints at the knees that locked and released with small mechanical clicks. She gripped a cane in her right-hand knuckles, white with the effort of keeping herself upright, every muscle in her body visibly tensed against something invisible but overwhelming. But it was her face that hit Jack like a physical blow to the chest. She was trying so hard not to show the pain. Lips pressed into a thin line, eyes fixed on the ground in front of her, breathing carefully measured and controlled. He had seen that expression before, worn by someone he loved more than life itself. His brother Michael had carried that same mask every single day for the last 3 years of his existence, that desperate attempt to pretend the agony was manageable when it was anything but. The older woman's voice cut through Jack's observations like a blade through tissue. Sharp, crisp, professional, the kind of tone that expected immediate compliance and rarely faced disappointment in that expectation. "Excuse me, is there someone here who can help us? Our car has overheated." Jack pulled himself back to the present moment, back to being a mechanic in a struggling garage rather than a man drowning in memories of hospital rooms and broken promises. He walked toward them, noticing how the older woman positioned herself slightly in front of the girl, protective, in a way that spoke of years of practice. "That would be me. Jack Sullivan. Let me take a look." He moved past them to the Rolls-Royce, still idling, despite the steam beginning to escape from beneath its hood. One pop of the release lever, one careful lift of that pristine white hood, and the problem presented itself immediately. A coolant hose had burst, probably stressed by the punishing heat, leaving a spreading puddle of green fluid beneath the engine. Simple fix, 15 or 20 minutes at most. The kind of repair any competent mechanic could handle in their sleep. But Jack found himself glancing past the expensive German engineering, past the overheated components, and leaking hose toward the girl who had moved to lean against the shaded side of his building. Her face was turned away from the sun, but he could still see the tension in every line of her body, the way she held herself, as if standing still caused as much distress as moving. "Coolant hose," he said, straightening and turning back toward the older woman. "I can have it done in 20 minutes or so. You're welcome to wait inside where there's air conditioning. Not the Ritz, but it's cool." "Thank you." The words came out clipped efficient, the gratitude of someone who expected others to be grateful to her rather than the reverse. "I'm Victoria Thornton. This is my daughter Grace." The names meant nothing to Jack, though the way Victoria announced them suggested they should carry weight, should elicit some recognition or deference. He nodded toward Grace, who managed a small, exhausted smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Nice to meet you both. Let me get you settled inside, then I'll handle the car." The waiting room was nothing like what they were used to. Jack could tell that immediately from the way Victoria's gaze swept over the worn chairs, the ancient magazines still in Lisa's wire rack, the water cooler in the corner with its visible mineral deposits building up like tiny stalactites. But she did not complain, did not wrinkle her nose, or make any of the small, dismissive gestures Jack had come to expect from people who looked like she did. She simply helped Grace to the most stable-looking chair, moving with the synchronized efficiency of two people who had performed this exact dance countless times before. Grace lowered herself into the seat with agonizing slowness, every muscle in her body tensed against whatever internal battle she was fighting. When she finally settled, she released a breath that was almost a gasp, her eyes closing for just a moment before she gathered herself and opened them again. "Can I get you some water?" Jack offered. "Fair warning, the cooler is older than my daughter, but the water is cold." "Please." Grace's voice came out soft, almost unused, like she had grown accustomed to letting others speak for her. He filled 2 paper cups and handed them over. Victoria accepted hers with a nod that might have been gratitude in someone less armored. Grace took hers with both hands, and Jack noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, the way the simple act of holding a cup seemed to require effort she should not have needed to expend. "I'll be right outside if you need anything." He returned to the Rolls-Royce, moving through the familiar motions of loosening clamps, removing the burst hose fitting the replacement from his wall of spare parts. His hands knew this work well enough that his mind could wander and wander. It did straight toward the girl sitting in his waiting room, with legs locked in metal and pain written across every feature. He knew more about mobility devices than most mechanics had any right to know. 8 years of watching Michael struggle with wheelchairs with braces similar to the ones Grace wore with experimental treatments that promised the moon and delivered dust. 8 years of learning to spot the signs of chronic pain of equipment that caused more problems than it solved, of the slow grinding erosion that happened when a body spent its days fighting against the very things meant to help it. The memory came unbidden, sharp-edged even after all this time. Michael in his hospital bed during those final weeks, thin as paper and twice as fragile, reaching out to grip Jack's wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me something little, brother." Jack's throat had been too tight for words, so he had just nodded. "If you ever see someone suffering the way I've been suffering, don't walk away. Don't pretend you don't see it. Don't be like everyone else who just accepts that this is how things have to be. I promise." Michael's smile had been tired but genuine, one of the last real smiles Jack would ever see on his brother's face. The worst part wasn't the chair or the pain. It was everyone treating me like I was made of glass, like I couldn't handle the truth about my own situation. Jack was tightening the final clamp on the new coolant hose when he heard it. A sharp intake of breath from inside the waiting room, almost a whimper, quickly stifled like someone had slapped a hand over their own mouth to keep the sound from escaping. Through the office window, he could see Grace shifting in her chair, her face contorted in an expression that had nothing to do with the awkward seating and everything to do with equipment that was failing her. Victoria was beside her immediately, one hand on her daughter's shoulder, murmuring something Jack could not hear through the glass. He should mind his own business. These were customers, strangers, people from a world so far removed from his that they might as well have arrived from Mars rather than wherever their white Rolls-Royce called home. The smart thing would be to finish the repair, take their money, and send them on their way. But Michael's voice echoed in his head, clear as the day those words had been spoken. "Don't walk away." Jack set down his wrench and walked back inside. "Everything all right in here?" Victoria looked up, and for just a fraction of a second her professional mask slipped. Underneath it, Jack saw exhaustion that went bone-deep, fear that had become so familiar it might as well be a second skin, and something that looked like hope in the process of dying a slow, painful death. "She's fine, just needs a moment. Mom, I'm okay." Grace's voice came out strained tight with the effort of pretending. "Really?" Jack pulled up one of the other mismatched chairs and sat down without asking permission, putting himself at eye level with Grace, rather than towering over her. "Mind if I ask what kind of braces those are?" Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering across her features. "They're custom orthotic devices, made by one of the best medical equipment manufacturers in the country." "Why?" "I'm sure they are." Jack kept his tone casual, the same voice he used when explaining to customers what was wrong with their cars. "But they're hurting her." "Grace has a spinal condition." Victoria's voice took on an edge sharp enough to cut. "The braces are necessary for support. Her doctors have—" "I'm not questioning her doctors," Jack interrupted as gently as he could manage. "But I spent 8 years watching my brother deal with braces like these wheelchairs, every kind of mobility aid you can imagine. And I learned to tell the difference between necessary pain, the kind that comes with the territory, and pain that's being caused by the equipment itself." Grace looked up at him then, and Jack saw something shift behind her eyes. Interest, maybe. Or hope, trying desperately not to be hope, because hope had let her down too many times before. "What do you mean? When you're standing or walking, where does it hurt the most?" "My hips." The answer came immediately without hesitation. "And my lower back, but that's normal. The doctors say it's just compensation from compensation." Jack nodded slowly. "Your body's trying to work around the braces instead of with them. Let me ask you something else. May I take a closer look? I won't touch anything without permission." Victoria started to object, mouth opening on what would surely be a refusal, but Grace spoke first. "Yes, please." Jack moved closer, crouching down to examine the braces without making contact. They were impressive pieces of engineering, he had to admit. Carbon fiber frames that probably weighed less than half of what metal equivalents would. Titanium joints with what looked like microprocessors embedded at the knees and hips. Precision manufacturing that must have taken months of specialized work. But the angles were wrong. "The knee joints," he pointed without touching. "They're locked at slightly different angles. See how your left leg sits maybe 2 degrees more extended than your right. That means when you stand, your hips aren't level. Your left hip sits higher, so your spine has to curve to compensate. Every single step you take, your lower back is twisting to keep you upright." Grace stared at him with an expression he could not quite read. "I've seen 17 different specialists, physical therapists, orthopedic surgeons, neurologists. Nobody ever—" Her voice cracked, something breaking beneath the surface. "They all said the pain was part of my condition, that I just needed to manage it better. Try harder. Be stronger." "How long have you been wearing these specific braces?" 3 years. Victoria's voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something that might have been doubt. "They cost $800,000. Jack let out a low whistle before he could stop himself. Well, that's unfortunate, because they're working against her, not for her. The problem isn't Grace's condition. It's that these braces are fighting her body instead of supporting it. Victoria stood up so abruptly, the chair scraped against the floor. Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your concern, but my daughter has received care from some of the most renowned physicians in the world, people with decades of experience and multiple advanced degrees from institutions you've probably never heard of. And I'm a mechanic with dirty hands and a high school diploma. Jack stood as well, meeting her eyes without flinching. I get it. I understand why you dismiss anything I have to say. But credentials don't mean much if the fundamentals are wrong. And the fundamental problem here is balance. He paused, organizing his thoughts the way he would when explaining a complex engine problem to a customer who did not speak the language of cars. Everything in motion, whether it's a car or a human body, needs to be balanced around its center of gravity. These braces are forcing Grace's center of gravity to shift with every single step. That's why she's in pain. Not because of her condition, but because the equipment meant to help her is constantly pushing her body into positions it can't comfortably maintain. The silence that followed felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane, that stillness before the wind either dies completely or tears everything apart. Victoria closed her eyes. When she opened them again, Jack saw something he had not expected. Desperation raw and undisguised. This woman, who probably commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions before breakfast, was looking at him like a drowning person watching someone throw a rope that might or might not reach the water. You have no credentials. Her voice came out, measured each word carefully placed. No medical license, no engineering degree. If you're wrong about this, if you hurt her, then you'll sue me for everything I own. Jack shrugged slightly. Wouldn't take very long. I understand the risk you'd be taking, but I have to ask, what risk is Grace taking if nothing changes, if she keeps wearing equipment that's hurting her every single day? Grace made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, impossible to tell which. I'll be exactly where I am right now. Stuck, hurting, watching my life happen through a window while everyone else gets to actually live theirs. Victoria's hand tightened on her daughter's shoulder knuckles, whitening with the pressure. Grace, you don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. Grace's voice gained strength, determination, flooding into the spaces where exhaustion had lived moments before. I know you've spent millions. I know you've flown me all over the world to see specialists who all said the same things. I know you've done everything a mother could possibly do. Her voice broke again, but she pushed through it. But Mom, I'm 19 years old, and I can't remember what it feels like to stand without pain. If there's even a chance that something could be different, I have to take it. Victoria pulled her daughter close, and Jack looked away, giving them privacy for a moment too raw for strangers to witness. He heard them crying together, mother and daughter clinging to each other in that small, ugly waiting room with its broken coffee maker and outdated magazines. And he thought about Michael in that hospital bed, about promises made in the presence of approaching death. After a long moment, Victoria straightened. She wiped her eyes with precise movements that suggested she rarely allowed herself the luxury of tears. What would you need to do? First, just examine the braces more carefully. Jack's voice remained steady calm, the voice he used when customers were panicking about repair estimates. Take some measurements. See exactly what's going on with the alignment. Then, if I'm right about the problem, I'd need to take them apart and adjust the joint angles. It's delicate work, but it's not complicated. Not really. When? Jack checked his watch. Just past 2 in the afternoon. Lily would not be home from school until 4, and Mrs. Chen's Civic was essentially done. Now works if you've got time. Your car will be ready in 10 minutes anyway. Victoria looked around the garage again, taking in the cracked floors, the ancient equipment, the general atmosphere of a place held together by stubborn determination rather than adequate funding. This was not a state-of-the-art medical facility. This was barely a functioning automotive repair shop. But her daughter was looking at Jack Sullivan like he had just offered her something precious beyond measure, something she had stopped believing she could ever have. All right. Victoria's voice carried the weight of someone making a decision against every instinct she possessed. But I want to be very clear about something. If at any point I think you're causing harm, we stop immediately. Absolutely. Jack nodded. I wouldn't have it any other way. He finished the Rolls-Royce repair while Victoria made phone calls, canceling appointments, and rearranging schedules with the clipped, efficient language of someone who expected their schedule to bend to their will rather than the reverse. Grace sat quietly in the waiting room, watching Jack work through the window with an intensity that made him self-conscious of every movement. When he closed the hood and walked back inside, she was still watching him. You can ask whatever you're wondering. He grabbed a clean rag and wiped his hands, though they were already as clean as they were going to get. I can tell you've got questions. Your brother... Grace's voice came out soft, almost tentative. You said you took care of him for 8 years. What happened? Jack was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share with this stranger he had known for less than an hour. But something about her eyes, the way she asked, told him she was not seeking gossip or making conversation. She wanted to understand. Motorcycle accident. He was 24. I was 22. We were fixing up an old Harley he'd bought from a junkyard, spent the whole summer getting it running. Jack's hand stilled on the rag. First test ride, an SUV ran a red light. Driver never saw him. Michael was paralyzed from the waist down. I'm sorry. Yeah, me too. Jack cleared his throat. But Michael, he didn't give up. Spent 8 years trying everything, every treatment, every experimental procedure, every new piece of equipment that promised to help. I was right there with him for all of it. Learned more about mobility aids and medical devices than I ever wanted to know. What happened to him? Pneumonia. The word came out flat, emotionless, because Jack had learned that was the only way he could say it without breaking. His immune system was compromised from all the medications. He fought it for 2 weeks. I'm so sorry. Before he died, he made me promise something. Jack finally met her eyes. Said if I ever saw someone dealing with what he dealt with, I shouldn't just walk by. Shouldn't pretend I didn't notice. That's the thing about suffering. Once you've really seen it up close, you can't unsee it. Can't pretend it's not happening right in front of you. Grace nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her expression. Most people pretend pretty well. Most people haven't watched someone they love struggle every single day just to exist. Changes your perspective on things. He set up a workspace in the garage bay, clearing off his largest table and positioning it near the best light source. Victoria helped Grace over the two of them, moving in that synchronized way again, years of practice evident in every motion. Grace sat on the table's edge while Jack pulled up a stool and grabbed a notebook from his cluttered desk. First things first, I need to understand the mechanics of what we're working with here. Tell me about what happened. How did you end up in braces? Grace took a deep breath, and Jack could see her mentally stepping back through years of painful memories. I was 8. We were at the beach, just Mom and me. It was this rare day where she wasn't working, where we actually got to spend time together. A faint smile crossed her face there and gone like a shadow. There was a sandbar, maybe 100 yards out. I swam toward it, but I didn't see the riptide. She paused, and Victoria's hand found her shoulder again. I went under. Mom dove in after me, but by the time she got me back to shore, I'd been without oxygen for almost 4 minutes. The brain damage affected my motor control, specifically my legs. The doctors said I'd never walk again. But you did. Jack gestured toward the braces. You're walking. With help. Intensive therapy, experimental treatments, these braces. Technically, I can walk. Grace's eyes closed. But it's like my body is fighting itself every single second. And it hurts. It always hurts. Jack made notes in his cramped handwriting, sketching rough diagrams of the brace structure as he asked more questions. The pain, was it constant, or did it spike during certain movements, both Grace told him. There was a baseline around 4 out of 10 that never went away, but walking pushed it up to 7 or 8. Standing still was actually worse sometimes because all the pressure just concentrated on her hips and spine with nowhere to go. He examined each component of the braces in turn, running his fingers along the edges and seams without directly touching Grace's body, asking permission before getting close. He could see the pressure points, places where the metal and composite had rubbed against skin for so long that there were permanent marks, calluses that should never have formed. After 45 minutes of careful examination and detailed notes, he sat back and looked at both women. Okay, I think I understand what's happening here. Victoria leaned forward, every line of her body tense with anticipation. And the braces are engineered beautifully. Whoever designed them knew their materials, understood the mechanics of load distribution, put real genius into the construction. But they built them for a theoretical patient, not for Grace specifically. He flipped his notebook around so they could see his sketches. Look at the hip joints here. These are set at angles that would be perfect for someone with completely symmetrical muscle development and bone structure. But Grace's right side is stronger than her left because that's how her body has compensated over the years. The braces don't account for that. They're forcing both sides to move identically, which means her body has to fight against the stronger side to accommodate the weaker one. So what would you do differently? Grace leaned forward, despite the pain it caused her, hungry for understanding. I'd adjust the joint angles to account for your natural compensation patterns. Instead of fighting them, we work with them. I'd also redistribute the contact points. Right now, too much pressure is concentrated at your hips and lower spine. We could spread that load more evenly across your legs. He hesitated for a moment, considering whether to share his last observation. There's something else. What? Victoria's voice had lost its earlier sharpness, replaced by something closer to desperate hope. The weight. These braces are heavy because they're built to be incredibly strong, but strength isn't always what you need. Sometimes you need flexibility, the ability to move with the body, rather than restricting it. I think we could rebuild certain sections with lighter materials, keep the structural integrity where it actually matters, but reduce the overall load Grace is carrying by maybe 15 or 20%. Grace's eyes were bright with something Jack recognized as dangerous. Hope was a knife that cut both ways, and he had seen it slice through his brother's heart every time a new treatment failed to deliver on its promises. How long would all of that take? To make the modifications I'd need to completely disassemble the braces, which means you'd need another way to get around while I'm working on them. I have a wheelchair. Grace's voice carried distaste for the words. In the car. I hate it, but I have it. Then I'd say a week, maybe 2. I'd need to source some specialized materials, do the actual mechanical work test everything multiple times before we try it on you. Jack set down his notebook. We'd need to take this slowly and carefully. We can pay you. Victoria reached for her purse. Whatever you need, name your price. I don't want your money. Jack held up a hand when she started to protest. Not yet. Not until we know if this actually works. If the modifications help and Grace is in less pain, you can pay me a fair rate for labor and materials. If it doesn't work, if I'm wrong about everything, he shrugged. Then it's on me. Victoria stared at him like he had suddenly started speaking in tongues. I don't understand. Why would you do this? Why take this risk for someone you just met? Jack thought about Michael in that hospital bed, about promises made while the smell of death hung in the air. He thought about his own daughter Lily and how he would move mountains for her if she ever needed him to. He thought about all the times he had wished anyone would look at Michael's situation and question whether there might be a better way. Because I can. He kept his voice simple, direct. And because Grace asked. That's enough. The process of removing the braces took almost 20 minutes. Grace needed help from both Jack and her mother, each buckle and strap carefully loosened and released. When the final piece came away from her body, Grace was trembling, pale as paper, looking suddenly smaller and more fragile, without the exoskeleton that had both supported and tormented her for 3 years. God, I hate this part. Her whisper carried weight beyond the words. Hate what specifically? Being helpless, being the girl in the wheelchair who needs help with everything. Tears glistened in Grace's eyes, though she blinked them back. I know I should be grateful I can walk at all. The doctors said I never would. But sometimes I just want to run. Just once. I want to know what it feels like. Jack looked at this girl who had been dealt such a terrible hand and had somehow not let it destroy her. The weight of what he had promised to attempt settled even heavier on his shoulders. We'll get you there. He meant every word. One way or another. They worked out the logistics over the next hour. Grace would need to be without the braces for at least a week, probably 2. Victoria would clear her schedule to stay with her daughter in San Diego, booking rooms at a nearby hotel. Jack would need detailed specifications from the brace manufacturer, which Victoria promised to obtain, regardless of what confidentiality agreements she had to breach. By the time they drove away, the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, painting the garage in shades of amber and gold. Jack helped Grace into the car, watching as she maneuvered her wheelchair with practiced efficiency, despite her obvious distaste for needing it. Thank you. She looked up at him from the chair, something fragile and precious in her expression. For seeing me. For believing you might be able to help. Haven't helped yet. Jack kept his voice grounded, realistic. Let's see if I can actually pull this off before we start celebrating. You will. Grace spoke with absolute certainty, the kind of faith that came from somewhere beyond logic or evidence. I don't know why, but I believe you will. After the white Rolls-Royce disappeared around the corner, Jack stood in his empty garage looking at the notes he had taken, the sketches he had drawn. What had he gotten himself into? He was a mechanic, not a medical professional. He fixed cars, not people. If this went wrong, if he made things worse for that girl. But then he thought about the expression on Grace's face, that desperate dying hope, suddenly flickering back to life. He thought about Michael, about all the times his brother had wished someone would just try something different instead of sticking to protocols and procedures that clearly were not working. He thought about promises made and the weight of keeping them. "All right, Michael." He spoke to the empty air, to the memory of a brother 5 years gone. "I'm going to need your help on this one." His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Lily. "Are you coming home for dinner? I'm making pasta. Don't worry, I promise not to burn the kitchen down this time." Jack smiled despite everything, despite the weight of what he had just agreed to attempt. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever challenges the coming weeks might bring tonight, he would go home to his daughter and try not to think about all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. The house was quiet when Jack walked through the front door, but the smell of garlic and tomatoes told him Lily had actually followed through on her pasta promise. He found her at the kitchen table, algebra textbook open, but clearly forgotten her attention, fixed on the phone in her hands, until she heard his footsteps. "You're late." She did not look up immediately. "And you've got that look on your face." What look would that be? The one you get when you're about to do something that's either really smart or really stupid, and you haven't figured out which yet. She finally raised her eyes to meet his. "So, which is it this time? Another project car you're going to restore and never finish?" "Not a car." Jack dropped his keys on the counter and headed for the fridge, suddenly aware of how hungry he was. A person. That got her full attention. Lily set down her phone, giving him the same intense focus she usually reserved for her favorite streaming shows. "What person?" He told her everything while they ate Lily's surprisingly decent pasta. About the Rolls-Royce and the woman who stepped out of it. About Grace and her braces. About examining the equipment and seeing problems that 17 specialists had apparently missed. About promising to try something that might help or might make everything worse. Lily listened without interrupting, occasionally asking questions that were sharper than most adults would think to ask. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and studied him with eyes that were entirely too old for a 14-year-old face. "So, let me get this straight. You're going to take apart medical equipment that cost more than our house equipment made by actual doctors and engineers with actual degrees and rebuild it based on what you learned from Uncle Michael. That's the general idea. And you're doing this for a complete stranger because her mom's car broke down in front of your garage. When you put it that way, it sounds kind of crazy." "It sounds exactly like something Uncle Michael would have loved." Lily's voice softened, losing its teenage edge. "He always said the worst part wasn't the wheelchair. It was everyone treating him like he was made of glass, like he couldn't handle the truth about his own situation." "I remember. He made you promise, didn't he, before he died, that you wouldn't look away when you saw someone suffering like he did. You remember that. I was 9, Dad. I remember everything about those last few weeks." Lily stood up and kissed the top of his head the way Lisa used to do, the gesture so familiar it made his chest ache. "Go be a hero. Just try to get some sleep at some point. You look like you haven't slept properly in about 5 years." She was right, of course. Jack could not remember the last time he had slept through an entire night without waking up at least once, without lying in the darkness, thinking about everyone he had failed and everyone he might still fail if he was not careful. But instead of sleeping, he pulled out his laptop after Lily went to bed and dove into research. Medical journals he barely understood, technical papers on biomechanics and gait analysis, videos of physical therapy sessions and mobility aid fittings. He read about joint angles and load distribution, about compensation patterns and pressure points, about all the ways the human body adapted to damage and all the ways that adaptation could cause more damage in turn. By 2 a.m, his eyes were burning and his brain felt like overcooked oatmeal. But he had the beginnings of a plan, rough sketches in his notebook that might just work. The modifications he wanted to make were not revolutionary. They were just logical applications of principles he already understood from years of working with machines. Balance, distribution of force, working with a system's natural tendencies instead of against them. He finally fell asleep at the kitchen table, head pillowed on his arms, dreaming of angles and joints, and a girl who had forgotten what it felt like to move without pain. Victoria called at exactly 8 the next morning, while Jack was still trying to wash the fog of too little sleep from his brain with coffee strong enough to strip paint. "I'm having the manufacturer's specifications sent to your email." No greeting, no small talk. "They should arrive within the hour. I may have threatened legal action to get them to cooperate." "I'm not going to ask how that conversation went. That would be wise." A pause. "I also wanted to ask when you can start the actual work. I need to look over the specs first. Make sure I understand exactly what I'm dealing with. Can you bring Grace by this afternoon? Maybe around 2. I want to take some more detailed measurements in better light." "We'll be there." The specifications arrived at 9:15, and Jack spent the next 4 hours poring over them. The braces were even more sophisticated than he had initially thought. Microprocessors in every major joint that adjusted resistance based on movement patterns. Sensors throughout the frame that tracked stress distribution in real time. Composite materials that were stronger than steel at a fraction of the weight. Someone had put serious engineering genius into these devices. Someone had spent months, maybe years, perfecting every component. But somewhere along the way, they had forgotten that these braces were meant to help a specific human being, not just meet theoretical specifications on paper. At 2 o'clock, sharp the white Rolls-Royce pulled into his lot again. This time, Jack was ready for them, his workspace organized, his notes spread out, where he could reference them quickly. Grace maneuvered her wheelchair through the garage bay door with aggressive competence, the kind of skill that comes from doing something you hate every single day. "I wanted to see where the magic happens." She looked around the workspace with genuine interest, none of her mother's barely concealed disdain. "Though, I have to say, it's not quite what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something more medical, I guess. More sterile. This is just..." She gestured at the car parts and tools and scattered components. "It's a garage. Best kind of place for fixing things that are broken." Jack pulled up a stool beside his workbench, where the disassembled braces now lay in organized sections. "And that's what we're doing here. Fixing something that should never have been broken in the first place." He walked her through his analysis using the actual components to illustrate what he had discovered. The angular discrepancies in the knee joints, the pressure points that were concentrating force in all the wrong places, the weight distribution that was forcing her body to compensate in ways that caused more damage with every step. Grace listened with the intense focus of someone who had spent years trying to understand her own situation and never quite succeeding. When he finished explaining his proposed modifications, she reached out and picked up one of the knee joints, turning it over in her hands with a familiarity that surprised him. This is the part that catches sometimes. When I'm walking, it's supposed to release smoothly, but it gets stuck. She ran her fingers along the mechanism. It's like it's waiting for me to do something I physically can't do. That's exactly what's happening. Jack took the joint from her and pointed to a small sensor embedded in the housing. This measures the angle of flexion and tells the microprocessor when to release the lock, but the threshold is set too high. Your natural walking gait doesn't quite reach that angle, so the joint thinks you're not ready to take your next step. So it's waiting for me to do something impossible. Grace's voice carried something bitter. Story of my life. Everyone waiting for me to do things I can't do, then wondering why I'm not trying hard enough. Victoria made a small sound from where she stood near the door, something between pain and protest. Jack met Grace's eyes directly. We're going to change those thresholds. Make the joints respond to what you can actually do, not what some algorithm decided you should theoretically be capable of. They stayed for another 2 hours while Jack took more measurements, asked more questions, refined his understanding of exactly how Grace's body moved, and where the braces were fighting against those natural patterns. Victoria watched everything with hawk-like intensity, occasionally asking questions that revealed she had spent the previous night doing her own research. By the time they left, the sun was starting its descent toward the Pacific, and Jack had everything he needed to begin the actual modifications. Lily appeared from somewhere in the back of the garage as soon as the Rolls-Royce disappeared around the corner. She's nice, kind of scary smart too. Some of those questions she was asking about joint mechanics and force distribution. She shook her head. She's not just a patient. She's been studying her own condition like it's a full-time job. When something controls your entire existence, you either learn everything about it or you go crazy. Jack started organizing his tools for the work ahead. Michael was the same way. Knew more about spinal injuries and mobility equipment than most of his doctors. Do you really think you can help her? Jack paused, looking at the components spread across his workbench. Carbon fiber and titanium and sophisticated electronics, all of it worth more than his house and his garage combined. I don't know. Honesty was something he had always given his daughter, even when it hurt. But I'm going to try like hell. The first 3 days were dedicated entirely to understanding. Jack worked late into the night after the regular customers had gone home, methodically disassembling every component of the braces and documenting how they fit together. He measured angles to fractions of degrees, tested joint resistance at every point in their range of motion, mapped out exactly where and how the braces were supposed to interact with Grace's body. The work was painstaking but necessary. He could not afford to make assumptions. Every modification he planned would have consequences, and he needed to understand exactly what those consequences might be before he started changing anything. Lily would come to the garage after school, doing her homework on the old couch in the office while her father worked. Sometimes she would wander over to ask questions, and Jack would explain what he was doing, teaching her the same way he had once taught Michael about engines and transmissions. You talk about people like their cars, she observed on the third evening, watching him test the resistance of a hip joint mechanism. Bodies are simpler in some ways, more complicated in others. Jack adjusted a setting and tested again. but the basic principles are the same. Everything needs to be balanced. Everything needs to work together. And when something's wrong, you have to find the root cause, not just treat the symptoms. The design specifications from the manufacturer had been helpful, but they had also revealed something troubling. The braces had been built according to a standard template, modified only slightly to account for Grace's basic measurements: height, weight, leg length. The superficial numbers that any custom fitting would require. But nobody had taken the time to understand how Grace actually moved, how her left leg swung differently than her right because of the way her brain damage had affected her motor control, how her hips naturally tilted at an angle that was barely perceptible but threw off everything when you forced them to remain level, how her spine had curved slightly over years of compensation, creating new requirements that the original designers could not have anticipated. Jack made notes on all of it, sketching modifications that would address each issue. By the end of the third day, his notebook was filled with drawings and calculations, a roadmap for transforming equipment that fought against Grace's body into something that might finally work with it. On the morning of the fourth day, his phone rang with a number he recognized. Victoria's voice came through clear and direct. Grace wanted me to ask if she could come see the progress today. She's been anxious about it, can barely sleep. Sure, I was actually going to call you. I'm ready to start making changes, but I want to walk her through what I'm planning first. Make sure I haven't missed anything about how the braces actually feel when she's wearing them. They arrived at one Grace in her wheelchair again, her expression a mixture of anticipation and carefully controlled hope. Victoria followed close behind her own expression, harder to read. Jack spread his notes and sketches across the workbench, walking them through each modification he planned to make. The adjusted joint angles, the redistributed contact points, the sections where he would replace heavier materials with lighter alternatives that would maintain structural integrity while reducing the overall load. Grace asked questions that proved Lily right about her intelligence. She understood the mechanics, challenged his assumptions, suggested considerations he had not thought of. Victoria mostly listened, though she occasionally interjected with practical concerns about testing and safety. "How will you know if it's working?" Victoria asked when Jack finished his presentation. "Before Grace tries wearing them again." "I've built a testing rig." He gestured toward a contraption in the corner of the garage, a framework of metal and straps that looked vaguely medieval. "I can mount the braces there and run them through simulated movement cycles. Test the joints under load, check the balance points, make sure nothing is going to fail unexpectedly. And if something does fail, if you put them back on Grace and there's a problem, then we stop immediately. Take them off, figure out what went wrong, fix it, and try again." Jack met Victoria's eyes directly. "I won't let her get hurt. That's a promise." Victoria held his gaze for a long moment, something passing between them that Jack could not quite identify. Then she nodded just once. "I believe you actually mean that." The work itself began that afternoon and continued for the next 3 days. Jack operated on almost no sleep, pushing himself the way he had not pushed since the early days of starting his own garage, when failure meant losing everything, and success was never guaranteed. He adjusted the joint angles, first the most fundamental changes. Then he rebuilt the contact point system, spreading the load across Grace's legs more evenly instead of concentrating it at her hips and spine. He replaced the heaviest sections of the frame with lighter composites that he had sourced from an aerospace supplier who owed him a favor. Every change went through the testing rig, subjected to thousands of simulated movement cycles, Before Jack was satisfied, he recorded everything, photographing each step, documenting his reasoning and his results. If this worked, other people might want to know how. If it failed, he wanted a record of exactly what he had tried and why. By the 7th day, the modified braces sat on his workbench, looking almost identical to how they had looked when Grace first removed them in his garage. But everything under the surface had changed. The angles, the balance, the distribution of weight and force. A new piece of equipment wearing the skin of the old. He called Victoria at 8 in the morning, unable to wait any longer. "They're ready." His voice came out rough from too little sleep. "The first prototype anyway. I want Grace to try them." Grace arrived within the hour, moving faster in her wheelchair than Jack had ever seen her move, practically racing through the garage bay door with Victoria struggling to keep up. "You finished?" Grace's eyes went immediately to the braces on the workbench. "They're done. First version is done. Might need adjustments once you're wearing them, but yeah." Jack picked up the first component, the section that would wrap around her right leg from hip to knee. Ready to try. The fitting process took almost as long as the removal had a week earlier. Jack worked carefully, methodically making small adjustments to each strap and contact point as he went. Victoria hovered nearby, ready to intervene if anything seemed wrong. When the last piece was secured, Jack stepped back and looked at his work. The braces sat differently on Grace's body, now the angles subtle but noticeably changed from before. "How does it feel?" Grace shifted slightly, testing the fit. "Different. Lighter." She moved again, surprise flickering across her features. "The pressure on my hips, it's less. That's the idea." Jack felt something loosen in his chest tension he had not realized he was holding. "Think you can stand with Jack on one side and Victoria on the other?" Grace eased off the table and onto her feet. For a long moment, she just stood there perfectly still, breathing carefully like someone testing ice that might or might not hold their weight. "Well?" Victoria's voice came out tight-wound with anxiety she was barely controlling. "It's better." Grace took a single step, then another. "The hip pain is definitely less, but..." She stopped, something shifting in her expression. "Oh. What's wrong?" "The left knee. She took another step, and Jack saw the problem immediately. The joint was releasing too early before her leg was properly positioned to take her weight. She stumbled slightly, catching herself on Victoria's arm. "Sit down." Jack was already reaching for his notebook. "I see what happened." Grace lowered herself back onto the table, frustration and disappointment warring across her features. It was working. The hips felt so much better, but now the knee. "I overcorrected." Jack was sketching rapidly, his mind already working through the solution. "When I adjusted the angle, I changed the point where the sensor triggers the release. Now it's responding too quickly instead of too slowly." "Can you fix it?" 2 days, maybe 3. He looked up from his notes, meeting Grace's eyes. "This is exactly what I warned you about. Problems. Setbacks, things that don't work right the first time. But we learned something important today. We learned your fix made things worse." Victoria's voice carried an edge again, fear manifesting as anger. "We learned the hip modifications work." Jack kept his voice calm, steady. "Grace, when you were standing before you tried to walk, did your hips hurt?" Grace thought about it, surprise slowly replacing frustration. "No, they didn't. For the first time in years, I was standing and my hips weren't screaming at me." "So we know that part is working. We just need to fine-tune the knees. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's how progress works when you're doing something nobody's done before. The next 2 days blurred together into a haze of testing and adjustment and testing again. Jack barely slept, barely ate, working through every scenario he could imagine. He recalibrated the sensor thresholds, adjusted the spring resistance in the knee mechanisms, tested everything obsessively on his rig until he was as certain as he could be that the problems were solved. Lily found him asleep at his workbench on the second night, head pillowed on his arms, the way he had fallen asleep at the kitchen table so many nights before. "Dad," she shook his shoulder gently, "you need to actually sleep in a bed. Grace needs you functioning, not collapsed from exhaustion." "I'm close." His voice came out slurred. "Almost there. The braces will still be here tomorrow. Come home." He let her lead him to his truck, too tired to argue. In his dreams that night, Michael was there, not the sick Michael from those final weeks, but the Michael from before, strong and whole, and grinning as they worked together on that old Harley. "You're doing good, little brother," Dream Michael's voice echoed strangely. "Keep going." The second prototype was ready on the morning of the 10th day. Grace and Victoria arrived as soon as Jack called, tension radiating from both of them in different frequencies. Hope and fear braided together so tightly they were impossible to separate. The fitting went smoothly this time. Jack had learned from the first attempt, knew where to watch for problems, how to adjust the straps for optimal comfort. When the last piece was in place, Grace sat on the edge of the table and took a deep breath. "Ready? Ready." She stood, and both knees locked and released smoothly. She took 1 step, then 2, then 5. Each movement came easier than the last, her body beginning to find its new rhythm with the modified equipment. "How's the pain?" Jack watched her carefully, looking for any sign of distress. "It's there." Grace was still walking, moving around the garage with increasing confidence. "But it's different. Less sharp, more like pressure than pain." "Rate it for me, 1 to 10. Maybe a 5 compared to the usual 7 or 8. She stopped, breathing hard but smiling. "But I'm tired, like really tired. My legs feel like rubber." "That's because you're using different muscle groups. The braces are making your body work differently, so muscles that weren't being stressed before are suddenly doing work they're not used to." "Is that bad?" "It's good, mostly. It means Grace's body is adapting to the new support structure." Jack helped her back to the table to rest. "But it also means we need to build up her strength gradually. Can't just jump into using these all day." They established a testing schedule. Grace would come to the garage for short sessions, 20 minutes at first, then 30, then 45. Each time Jack made small adjustments based on her feedback. A slightly different angle here, a softer contact point there, a recalibrated sensor threshold that made a movement feel more natural. And each time Grace walked a little longer, stood a little straighter, complained about the pain a little less. On the 15th day, everything came together. The modifications were complete. The calibrations were perfect. And when Grace stood up from the table, she did not wince. She did not grimace. She did not hold her breath against the pain that had been her constant companion for 3 years. She simply stood, and then she smiled. "It doesn't hurt." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mom, it doesn't hurt." Victoria's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face before she could stop them. She pulled her daughter into an embrace so fierce It seemed like she might never let go. Both of them laughing and crying and trembling with the release of tension that had built for over a decade. Jack turned away, giving them privacy, feeling the weight of Michael's promise lift slightly from his shoulders. He had done it. He had actually done it. The modifications worked. When Grace finally pulled away from her mother, she walked across the garage toward Jack. Not carefully, not tentatively, but with something approaching normal confidence. She stopped in front of him and reached out to take his hands in hers. "You gave me my life back." Her voice cracked on the words. "You actually gave me my life back." "We're not done yet." Jack's own voice came out rough. "This is just the beginning. We need to make sure it holds up, need to test it in real conditions, need to—" "I know." Grace squeezed his hands. "But right now, in this moment, I'm standing in front of you without wanting to scream from the pain. That's something I didn't think I would ever feel again." She hugged him then, and Jack let her, feeling the gratitude and relief flowing off her in waves. Over her shoulder, he could see Victoria, watching them, tears still streaming down her face, something new in her expression, something that looked almost like peace. When Grace finally stepped back, she was grinning. "I want to try something." "What kind of something?" "I want to try walking outside. On real pavement, not just your garage floor. I want to see if this works in the real world." Jack looked at Victoria, who nodded despite the fear still lingering in her eyes. They had come too far to stop now. "All right, let's go see what you can do." They walked out of the garage together, Jack on one side and Victoria on the other, ready to catch Grace if anything went wrong. But nothing went wrong. Grace walked down the cracked sidewalk, navigating the uneven pavement with growing confidence. The braces adjusted to the changing terrain supporting her the way they had always been meant to, but had never quite managed before. When they reached the corner, Grace stopped and turned around. The look on her face was something Jack knew he would remember for the rest of his life. Pure joy, unfiltered and unrestrained, the expression of someone who had just discovered that the prison walls around them had suddenly become doors. "I did it." She was laughing now, tears mixing with the laughter. "I actually did it." And standing there in the fading California sunlight, watching this girl take her first real steps toward a life without constant pain, Jack Sullivan felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Hope. Real, genuine, unguarded hope. Michael would have been proud. The morning after Grace's breakthrough, Jack arrived at his garage before dawn. Sleep had been elusive, his mind racing through everything that could still go wrong, every way the modified braces might fail under real-world conditions. The success of yesterday felt fragile, like holding something precious made of glass while walking across ice. He unlocked the bay doors and stood in the darkness for a moment, breathing in the familiar smell of motor oil and metal. This space had been his sanctuary for 15 years, the place where broken things came to be made whole again. But yesterday had changed something fundamental about what happened within these walls. He was no longer just fixing cars. He was fixing lives. The fluorescent lights flickered on with their usual reluctance, casting the workspace in their intermittent glow. Jack walked to the workbench where his notes and sketches still lay scattered evidence of the obsessive focus that had consumed him for the past 2 weeks. He picked up a diagram showing the modifications he had made to Grace's braces, tracing the angular adjustments with his finger, remembering each decision and the reasoning behind it. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily. "Don't forget to eat actual food today. I left a sandwich in the fridge. Love you." Jack smiled despite his exhaustion. His daughter had become the keeper of his well-being since Lisa died, a reversal of roles that sometimes made him proud and sometimes made him ache with guilt for putting that burden on a child. She was 14 years old and already more responsible than most adults he knew. Victoria called at 7:30, her voice carrying an energy he had not heard before. Grace slept through the night. The words came out, rushed, almost breathless. She hasn't slept through the night in 3 years. The pain always woke her up sometimes, 2 or 3 times. But last night, nothing. She slept for 9 hours straight. Jack felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of anxiety he had not realized he was carrying. That's a good sign. It means the pressure redistribution is working even when she's not actively moving. It's more than a good sign, Mr. Sullivan. It's a miracle. Not a miracle, just mechanics. He kept his voice grounded, realistic. We still have a lot of testing to do. The garage floor is one thing. The real world is different. Grace wants to try walking outside today, farther than just around the block. She's talking about going to a park, walking on grass, maybe even some uneven terrain. Jack considered the request. Every instinct told him to proceed cautiously to test in controlled conditions before exposing the modifications to unpredictable variables. But he also knew that Grace had spent 11 years being cautious, being careful, being protected from everything that might cause her additional pain. At some point, she needed to discover what she was actually capable of. There's a park about a mile from here, Mission Trails, some paved paths, some natural terrain. If she's up for it, we could try a short walk there this afternoon. She'll be up for it. Victoria's voice carried absolute certainty. I'll have to physically restrain her from running out the door right now. They arrived at the garage just after 1 o'clock. Grace was already wearing the modified braces, moving with a confidence Jack had never seen in her before. She walked from the car to the garage bay door without her cane, without hesitation, without the constant grimace of pain that had marked her every movement when they first met. I want to try running. The words came out before Jack could even say hello. Victoria made a sound of protest, but Grace was already shaking her head. Not sprinting, just jogging, just to see if I can. Jack studied her, carefully looking for any sign of distress or instability. The braces were sitting correctly, the joints moving smoothly with each step she took. But running put exponentially more stress on the equipment than walking. If something was going to fail, that would be when it happened. Let's walk first. He kept his voice calm, the voice of a mechanic who has seen too many things go wrong to rush into anything. Try the park. See how the braces handle different terrain. If everything looks good after that, we can talk about running. Grace looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Jack's expression must have convinced her. She nodded reluctantly. Fine, but I'm holding you to that. The drive to Mission Trails took about 15 minutes. Jack followed behind in his pickup truck, watching the white Rolls-Royce navigate the suburban streets with that same careful precision Victoria always employed. He thought about the contrast between them, this woman in her cream-colored suits, an expensive car, and himself in faded jeans and a vehicle that was older than his daughter. Two worlds that should never have intersected, brought together by a broken coolant hose and a promise made to a dying brother. The park was relatively quiet for a weekday afternoon. A few joggers on the paved path, some families with children playing on the grass, an elderly couple walking a small dog that seemed more interested in investigating every bush than actually exercising. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that a small revolution was about to take place on their walking trail. Grace stepped out of the car and stood for a moment looking at the path that wound through the park and disappeared around a curve. Her expression was something between determination and wonder, like a prisoner seeing the outside world for the first time after years of confinement. "Ready?" Jack asked. "I've been ready for 11 years. They started slow, Grace setting the pace with Jack on one side and Victoria on the other. The paved path was smooth at first, easy terrain that the braces handled without difficulty. Grace walked with increasing confidence, her stride lengthening as she began to trust the equipment supporting her. About a quarter mile in the path transitioned to packed dirt. Grace slowed slightly, testing each step, letting the braces adjust to the new surface. Jack watched the joints, carefully looking for any sign of strain or malfunction. Everything seemed to be working correctly. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Different. The ground gives a little, so there's more absorption." Grace paused, considering. "Actually, it's easier in some ways. Less impact than the concrete." They continued the path, winding through a section of native California plants and scattered oak trees. The terrain became more challenging, small rocks and roots, creating obstacles that would have been impossible for Grace to navigate with her old braces. But the modifications were doing exactly what Jack had designed them to do, adjusting in real time to the changing conditions, supporting Grace's body instead of fighting against it. Victoria walked slightly behind them, her expression unreadable. Jack caught her wiping her eyes more than once, though she would never admit to crying. After about half a mile, they reached a section of the path that sloped upward, a gentle incline that led to a small overlook with benches. Grace stopped at the base of the slope, looking up at it like a mountaineer assessing a challenging peak. "This is going to be harder." "We can go around." Victoria's voice carried the protective instinct that had defined her relationship with her daughter for over a decade. "There's probably another path that—" "No." Grace's voice was quiet but firm. "I want to try." She started up the slope, and Jack saw immediately that the incline was putting different stresses on the braces. The left knee was working harder, compensating for the angle, while the right hip joint was adjusting its resistance to prevent her from leaning too far backward. Everything was operating within the parameters he had set, but he made mental notes about potential refinements. Halfway up, Grace stumbled slightly. Not a fall, just a momentary loss of balance as her foot caught on a protruding root she had not seen. Victoria gasped, reaching out, but Grace caught herself adjusted and kept going. "I'm fine." She did not look back. "I'm fine." When she reached the top of the slope, Grace stood at the overlook and stared out at the view. The park stretched below them, green and brown and golden in the afternoon light, with the distant mountains visible through the haze. She was breathing hard, her face flushed with exertion, but she was smiling. "I did it." Her voice came out, barely above a whisper. "I actually did it." Victoria had caught up by then, and Jack watched as she stood beside her daughter, both of them looking out at the view like they had never seen anything beautiful before. He gave them their moment, staying back a few steps, understanding that this was something between mother and daughter that did not require his presence. When they finally turned around, Grace's eyes were wet with tears. "I want to try running now." Jack assessed the situation. The path back down was gentler on the other side of the overlook, a gradual decline that eventually leveled out into a long, straight section of packed dirt. If Grace was going to try running, that would be the place to do it. "Not running." He held up a hand before she could protest. "Jogging." There's a difference, and only on the flat section, not the slope. Fine. Jogging. Grace's grin was contagious. Let's jog. They made their way down the gentler slope, Jack watching every step, every joint movement, every subtle shift in Grace's balance. The braces were performing beautifully, but he knew that running would change the stress patterns dramatically. Impact forces would increase. Response times would need to be faster. There were 100 ways this could go wrong. The flat section of the path stretched ahead of them, maybe 100 yards of packed dirt, with no obstacles, no sudden changes in terrain. Grace stood at the beginning of it, bouncing slightly on her toes, testing the feel of the braces under dynamic movement. Start slow. Jack positioned himself about 10 yards down the path. Just a fast walk at first, then, gradually, pick up speed. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you stop immediately. Got it. Grace was not really listening. Her eyes were fixed on the path ahead, her body already leaning forward in anticipation. She started walking, then faster still. Jack watched her feet leave the ground for just a fraction of a second, with each step the transition from walking to jogging happening so gradually it was hard to pinpoint the exact moment it occurred. And then she was jogging. Actually, jogging. Her feet hitting the packed dirt in a rhythm that was unmistakably running, her arms swinging naturally, her whole body moving in a way that had been impossible for over a decade. Grace covered about 50 yards before she slowed, then stopped, then turned around with an expression of pure, unfiltered joy. I did it! She was laughing and crying at the same time. Did you see that I actually ran? Victoria was already moving toward her daughter, running herself in a way that suggested she had not run anywhere in years. They collided in an embrace that was more collision than hug, both of them crying, both of them laughing, holding on to each other like they might never let go. Jack stood back and watched, feeling the familiar ache of witnessing something he could never be part of. He thought about Michael, about all the times his brother had dreamed of running again, of moving through the world, without the constant reminder of everything he had lost. Michael had never gotten that chance. But maybe in some way, Grace running down that park path was a victory for him too. When they finally separated, Grace walked back toward Jack. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright, her whole being radiating a kind of energy he had never seen in her before. Thank you. She reached out and took his hands in hers. I don't have words for what this means to me, for what you've given me. We're still testing. Jack kept his voice steady, though something in his chest was threatening to crack. We don't know yet if it'll hold up long term. It will. Grace's certainty was absolute. I know it will, because you built it, because you actually listened to what I needed instead of just looking at numbers on a chart. They walked back to the cars, slowly, Grace occasionally breaking into short jogs when the terrain permitted, testing the limits of her new capabilities. Victoria walked beside Jack, silent for a long time, before finally speaking. I owe you an apology. Jack glanced at her, surprised. For what? For doubting you. When you first suggested this, I thought you were either delusional or running some kind of scam. A mechanic in a rundown garage claiming he could fix something that the best doctors in the world couldn't. She shook her head. It sounded insane. It was insane. Still is, probably. No. Victoria stopped walking, turning to face him directly. What's insane is spending 11 years and millions of dollars on experts who never once questioned whether the equipment they were prescribing was actually helping. What's insane is accepting that my daughter would be in pain forever because someone with impressive credentials said so. She paused, her expression shifting to something Jack could not quite read. You saw her. Really saw her. Not as a diagnosis or a case study or a billing opportunity. You saw a person who was suffering and you decided to do something about it. That's not insane. She struggled for the word. That's humanity. Real humanity. Something I think I'd forgotten existed. Jack did not know how to respond to that. He was saved from having to try by Grace's voice calling from ahead, asking if they were going to stand there all day or actually make it back to the cars. The drive back to the garage was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Something had shifted between all of them, a barrier coming down that none of them had realized was there. Jack followed the white Rolls-Royce through the San Diego streets, thinking about what Victoria had said about being seen and about humanity. When they arrived at the garage, there was a small crowd gathered near the bay doors. Lily was there, along with Mrs. Chen and a few other regular customers Jack recognized. Word had apparently spread about what he had been working on. Grace stepped out of the car and walked toward them, and Jack watched the expressions on their faces change as they realized what they were seeing. This girl who had arrived 2 weeks ago, barely able to stand, was now walking toward them with confidence, with purpose, with the kind of natural movement that most people took completely for granted. Is this her? Mrs. Chen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl you were helping. Jack nodded, not trusting himself to speak. She's walking. Mrs. Chen sounded like she was witnessing a miracle. She's really walking. Running too. Grace had reached them now, grinning at the small crowd like she had known them all her life. Just jogged about 50 yards at the park. First time in 11 years. The questions came in a flood, then everyone talking at once, wanting to know what had happened, how Jack had done it, whether he could help other people with similar problems. Jack tried to answer as best he could, but he was distracted by something he saw in his peripheral vision. A man in a dark suit was photographing the scene from across the street. Not a customer, not someone Jack recognized from the neighborhood. Someone who had come specifically to observe what was happening. Jack filed the observation away, telling himself it was probably nothing. Probably just a curious passerby who happened to have a camera. Probably nothing to worry about. He was wrong. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by a courier who made Jack sign for it personally. Heavy paper, expensive letterhead, the kind of official document that always meant trouble. Jack opened it standing in the parking lot, squinting against the morning sun. It was from Brandt Medical Technologies, the company that had manufactured Grace's original braces. The language was formal, legal, and absolutely clear in its intent. They were aware that Jack had modified their proprietary medical device without authorization. They were aware that he had no medical credentials or engineering certifications. They were aware that he was operating outside the bounds of FDA regulations regarding medical device modification. They were demanding that he cease all activities related to the braces immediately. They were demanding that the modified devices be returned to them for inspection. And they were considering legal action for intellectual property theft, unauthorized medical practice, and reckless endangerment. Jack read the letter 3 times, his stomach sinking further with each pass. He had been so focused on helping Grace that he had not thought about the legal implications. He had modified a medical device worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He had effectively practiced medicine without a license. And now, a major corporation with unlimited legal resources wanted to shut him down. He called Victoria immediately. We got one too. Her voice was tight controlled the way it had been when they first met. They're threatening to sue me for allowing unauthorized modification of medical equipment. They're threatening to report Grace's case to the medical board as an example of what happens when people circumvent proper channels. I'm sorry. I should have thought about this. Don't apologize. Something steel entered Victoria's voice. You gave my daughter her life back. I'll deal with Brandt Medical. But it was not just Brandt Medical. Over the next week, more letters arrived. Medical societies expressing concern about patient safety. Disability advocacy groups with mixed responses, some supportive and some worried about the precedent being set. The state medical board requesting information about Jack's qualifications and activities. The pressure was intense and constant. Jack's phone rang at all hours with reporters wanting interviews, lawyers offering representation activists who thought he was either a hero or a menace, depending on their perspective. He stopped answering calls from numbers he did not recognize. Lily watched her father stress himself into exhaustion and finally put her foot down. You need to talk to someone who knows about this stuff. Like who? Like Grace. She's the one who's actually affected by all this. Lily caught herself on the name. She's the one who's actually affected by all this. What does she want to do? Jack realized he had been so busy defending himself that he had not asked the one person whose opinion actually mattered. He called Grace that evening. I was wondering when you'd reach out. Her voice was calm, steadier than he had expected. Mom told me about the letters, about Brandt trying to shut you down. I'm sorry. This is my fault. I should have been more careful. Should have gone through proper channels. There are no proper channels for what you did. Grace's voice was firm. That's the whole problem. The system is designed to protect companies like Brandt, not patients like me. So what do? We fight? The word came out with absolute conviction. We go public. We tell my story. We show the world what you did and why it mattered. Brandt wants to shut us down. Quietly make this go away before anyone asks uncomfortable questions about why their expensive equipment was causing harm. I say we make it loud. We make it so loud they can't ignore it. Jack's first instinct was to refuse. He did not want attention. He did not want to be a crusader or a symbol. He just wanted to help people keep his promise to Michael and live his quiet life. But then he thought about all the messages he had received over the past week. Parents whose children were struggling with braces that did not fit right. Veterans whose prosthetics caused chronic pain. People who had been told to accept their limitations because that was just how the equipment worked. If we do this, he said slowly, there's no going back. Brandt will come at us with everything they have. Other companies will too. We could lose. I've already lost. Grace's voice was quiet but unshakable. I lost 11 years of my life to pain and limitation. The worst thing they can do to me now is try to take away what you gave back. And I won't let that happen without a fight. The decision was made. They would go public, tell Grace's story, and let the world decide whether what Jack had done was reckless endangerment or necessary innovation. But first, they needed proof. Real scientific proof that the modifications worked. And for that, they needed someone with credentials that could not be dismissed. Victoria suggested Dr. Eleanor Chen. Dr. Eleanor Chen was a professor of biomedical engineering at Stanford, a woman whose research on adaptive prosthetics had earned her international recognition. More importantly, she had been publicly critical of medical device manufacturers who prioritized profit over patient outcomes. "She's our best shot." Victoria was showing Jack articles Dr. Chen had written about innovation barriers in the medical device industry. "If anyone will understand what you did and why it matters, it's her." The phone call was arranged for the following day. Jack sat in his garage office, surrounded by the evidence of his work, while Victoria put Dr. Chen on speaker. "Mrs. Thornton, I've reviewed the documentation you sent over." Dr. Chen's voice was sharp, efficient. "And frankly, I'm impressed." "Impressed good or impressed bad?" Victoria asked. "Both." A pause. What Mr. Sullivan did from a methodological standpoint was completely unorthodox. No safety protocols, no oversight, no approval process. From a regulatory standpoint, it's a nightmare. "But," Jack prompted, "but the results are extraordinary. The gait analysis data from your daughter shows significant improvements in joint stress distribution and energy efficiency. These aren't marginal gains. This is transformative." Dr. Chen agreed to visit the lab to examine Grace personally, to review every modification Jack had made. And more than that, she agreed to help them fight. "I've been waiting for someone to challenge companies like Brandt for years." Her voice carried an edge of anticipation. "They've been blocking innovation in mobility devices to protect their market share. I have evidence, internal emails, research reports that were suppressed. If we go public, I want to be part of this." The press conference was scheduled for 2 weeks later. 2 weeks to prepare to document everything to build a case that could withstand the assault that would surely come. Jack worked around the clock, photographing every component of the modified braces, documenting every adjustment he had made, compiling all his notes and sketches into a coherent presentation. Dr. Chen flew down from Stanford to conduct her own analysis, putting Grace through a battery of tests that made the original examination look cursory. "The modifications demonstrate an intuitive understanding of biomechanics that most of my graduate students struggle to achieve." Dr. Chen was reviewing the data on her laptop, her expression thoughtful. "You identified the core problem that the original braces were designed for a theoretical patient rather than Grace specifically. And you solved it using first principles engineering." "So I was right?" Jack asked. "You were brilliant. The question is whether the legal system will care about brilliant when there are rules being broken." The press conference was held at a hotel in downtown San Diego. Victoria had arranged everything with the kind of military precision that suggested she had done this many times before. A room that could hold 200 people was packed with 300 reporters and cameras and curious onlookers, all pressed together in the too warm space. Grace sat at the front table, Jack on one side and Dr. Chen on the other. Victoria stood slightly behind, one hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. The backdrop behind them displayed a simple message: patient care over corporate profit. Grace's prepared statement was simple and devastating. She described 11 years of pain. Doctors who told her it was normal. Equipment that cost nearly $1 million and made her feel like a prisoner in her own body. Meeting Jack, his careful questions, his refusal to accept that her suffering was inevitable. The moment she walked without pain for the first time. The moment she ran. Brandt Medical is threatening legal action. Grace's voice was steady despite the emotion behind it. They say Jack Sullivan broke rules. They say he's not qualified. They say what he did was dangerous." She paused and the room seemed to hold its breath. "But I'm sitting here in braces that don't hurt me. I'm sitting here able to walk and run and live my life. And Brant wants to call that dangerous. They want to take this away from me because Jack doesn't have the right pieces of paper on his wall." The room erupted in questions. Grace fielded them with impressive composure. Dr. Chen provided scientific credibility, explaining the biomechanics and the improvements. Jack said as little as possible, uncomfortable with being called a hero. "I'm just a mechanic who kept a promise." That was all he would say when asked about his motivations. "My brother made me promise that if I ever saw someone suffering the way he suffered, I wouldn't walk away. This was me keeping that promise." The public reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. Social media exploded with Grace's story. Disability rights advocates praised her courage. Other patients came forward with their own stories of equipment that caused more harm than good. But Brant Medical did not back down. They scheduled their own press conference within 48 hours, featuring doctors who warned about the dangers of unlicensed modifications, lawyers who outlined the legal consequences of circumventing proper channels, and a spokesperson who called Jack a reckless amateur playing with people's lives. The uncertainty was exhausting. Jack found himself second-guessing everything, lying awake at night, wondering if the surgeon on television was right. What if he had just gotten lucky? What if the modifications failed and Grace ended up worse than before? Lily found him in the garage at 2 a.m, staring at Grace's braces like they held answers to questions he could not quite articulate. "Can't sleep. Wondering if I made a mistake, not in helping Grace, but in going public with it. Maybe I should have just fixed her braces and left it at that. And let Brant keep selling equipment that hurts people. Let other families suffer because nobody wants to challenge the system." Lily shook her head. "Dad, I know this is scary, but you did something important. You proved that the system isn't always right. That sometimes the people with the credentials are wrong and the people with the heart are right. Your mother would have hated this." Jack smiled despite himself. "She always said I took too many risks. Mom also said you had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever met. She knew you couldn't see someone suffering and just walk by. That's why she loved you." The federal hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later in Washington, D.C., a preliminary review to determine if Jack's actions warranted prosecution. Victoria hired lawyers, expensive ones, who specialized in medical device litigation. They prepped Jack on what to say, how to present himself, how to appear competent but not arrogant. "Just be yourself." That was the advice from the lead attorney. "You're a sympathetic figure, the working-class hero who helped someone in need. Don't try to be something you're not." The night before they flew to D.C., Jack sat in his garage one last time, looking at the space where everything had started. The old chairs, the coffee maker, the scattered tools and equipment. This was who he was. A mechanic in a rundown garage trying to fix things that were broken. He thought about Michael, about the promise made in that hospital room 5 years ago. He thought about Grace, about the trust she had placed in him when she had every reason to be skeptical. He thought about Lily watching her father take a stand for what he believed in despite the risks. Whatever happened tomorrow, he had kept his promises. That had to count for something. The hearing room was smaller than Jack expected, formal and cold, with wood paneling and the seal of some federal agency he did not recognize on the wall. A panel of 5 people sat at a raised table, doctors, lawyers, bureaucrats, all of them looking at Jack like he was a particularly interesting specimen under examination. The Brandt medical lawyers went first, laying out their case with precision and barely concealed contempt. Jack had violated federal regulations. He had no credentials. He had conducted medical procedures without oversight. He represented a dangerous precedent that could undermine public safety and trust in the medical device industry. If we allow mechanics to modify medical equipment based on intuition, the lead lawyer argued, we open the door to chaos. Today, it's Mr. Sullivan making braces. Tomorrow, it's someone performing surgery in their garage. Where does it end? Then Dr. Chen presented her analysis. Clinical, precise, devastating to the opposition's case. She showed the data, explained the improvements, demonstrated exactly why Jack's modifications worked and why the original braces had failed. The question before you is not whether Mr. Sullivan broke rules. He did. Dr. Chen's voice was steady, authoritative. The question is whether those rules are serving patients or protecting corporate interests, because the evidence suggests that Brandt Medical knew their braces were causing problems and did nothing because fixing them would have cost money and market share. That got a reaction. The Brandt lawyers objected, demanding proof. Dr. Chen calmly presented internal emails she had obtained through research connections, communications between Brandt engineers, discussing the exact issues Jack had identified and deciding that redesigning the braces was not cost-effective. The room went very quiet. Finally, it was Jack's turn to speak. He walked to the microphone, feeling every eye in the room on him. Mr. Sullivan, the panel chairwoman, said, "Do you have anything you'd like to say in your defense?" Jack thought about all the prepared answers the lawyers had taught him, all the polished ways to frame what he had done, and then he set them aside. "I'm a mechanic. I fix things. Cars, trucks, whatever's broken. And when Grace Thornton came to my garage, I saw that she was broken, not because of her condition, but because of equipment that was supposed to help her. I don't have credentials. I don't have licenses. But I had 8 years of watching my brother struggle with equipment that was supposed to help, but mostly just reminded him of everything he'd lost. I learned to see when something was fighting against a body instead of supporting it. I learned to listen when patients said they were in pain." He paused, meeting the eyes of each panel member in turn. "I knew I was breaking rules. I did it anyway. Because sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same. I'm not saying we should throw out all the regulations, but when a 19-year-old girl is suffering every day because equipment that costs almost $1 million wasn't designed with her actual body in mind, and nobody in the system questions whether the problem might be the equipment instead of the patient, then something is wrong with the system." Grace asked to speak next. She had chosen to use her wheelchair for the hearing, wanting the panel to see what her life had been like before. Now, with Victoria's help, she stood up, removed the wheelchair, and walked across the hearing room. Not carefully, not tentatively, with confidence and strength. She walked to the panel's table, turned and walked back. "This is what Jack Sullivan gave me." Her voice was steady despite the emotion behind it. "This is what your regulations almost prevented. I'm not asking you to throw out all the rules. I'm asking you to remember that rules exist to help people, not to protect companies. And when the rules stop helping and start hurting, maybe it's time to change the rules." The panel deliberated for 2 hours. Jack sat in the hallway with Victoria Lily Grace and Dr. Chen. Nobody spoke, everyone lost in their own thoughts about what would happen if the decision went against them. When they were called back in, the chairwoman of the panel spoke. "We've reached a determination. Mr. Sullivan, you violated several federal regulations regarding medical device modification. Under normal circumstances, this would result in fines and possibly criminal charges." Jack felt his heart stop. "However," the chairwoman continued, "we also find that your modifications demonstrably improved patient outcomes, and that the original medical device was causing harm that the manufacturer failed to address despite being aware of the problem. Furthermore, Dr. Chen's testimony suggests that current regulations may be inhibiting patient-centered innovation." She looked directly at Jack. "We're issuing a special provisional license that will allow you to continue working on mobility devices under Dr. Chen's supervision. You'll need to complete certification courses in biomedical engineering and safety protocols. You'll be subject to regular inspections and audits. Any future modifications must be documented and reviewed before implementation." She paused. "But we're not going to punish you for helping someone when the system failed them." The room erupted. Victoria grabbed Jack's hand. Grace was crying. Lily was grinning. Even the lawyers looked surprised. It was not everything. It was not complete vindication. But it was enough. It was a door opening a possibility, a chance to keep helping people without destroying his life in the process. Outside the hearing room, reporters swarmed them with questions. This time, Jack did not hide. He stood beside Grace and answered honestly, talking about Michael, about promises kept, about the importance of listening to patients instead of just following protocols. That night, back at their hotel, Victoria ordered room service for everyone, a celebration that felt both earned and fragile. "What happens now?" Grace asked. "You're officially going to do this. Help other people." Jack looked at Dr. Chen, who nodded encouragingly. "I guess so. If people want my help and Dr. Chen thinks I won't kill anyone, we'll see what we can do." "We'll do more than see." Dr. Chen's voice carried steel. "We're going to change how this industry thinks about patient care, starting with you getting those certifications so this provisional license becomes permanent." Lily raised her glass of soda in a toast. "To Jack Sullivan, the world's most overqualified mechanic." They all drank to that. And Jack, for the first time in longer than he could remember, allowed himself to believe that maybe everything was going to be okay. But as he looked around at the people who had become his unlikely allies in this fight, he knew that the real work was just beginning. The hearing was over, but the mission was not. Tomorrow, they would start building something new. Something that could help not just Grace, but everyone like her who had been failed by a system that cared more about profits than people. Tomorrow, they would start changing the world. One patient at a time, one promise at a time, one step at a time. The morning after the hearing, Jack woke in his hotel room to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. News of the verdict had spread faster than he could have imagined. Local stations, national networks, medical journals, disability rights organizations. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. The mechanic who had beaten the system. The father who kept his promise. The man who proved that credentials were not everything. He ignored most of the calls and focused on the one that mattered. Victoria had sent a simple text at 6 in the morning. "Breakfast, my sweet. We need to talk about what comes next." What came next? Those 3 words carried weight that Jack was only beginning to understand. The hearing had given him permission to continue, but permission was not the same as a plan. He had modified one set of braces for one patient. The idea of doing more of building something that could help others felt like standing at the base of a mountain and being asked to climb without any equipment. Victoria's suite was larger than Jack's entire house. Grace was already there, still in pajamas, her modified braces leaning against the wall beside her chair. She looked more relaxed than Jack had ever seen her, the constant tension that had defined her movements finally beginning to ease. The phone hasn't stopped ringing. Victoria was pouring coffee from a silver carafe that probably cost more than Jack's coffee maker. Reporters, producers, other families who heard about Grace's case. Everyone wants to know if you can help them too. I'm one person. Jack accepted the coffee, noting that it was better than anything he had ever tasted. I work out of a garage that can barely handle oil changes some days. I can't help everyone. No. Victoria set down the carafe and looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize. The look of someone who had already made a decision and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. But you could help a lot more people if you had the right resources. She pulled out her tablet and showed him a series of documents: property listings, equipment catalogs, staffing projections. A business plan that must have taken days to prepare, though Jack suspected Victoria had people who could produce such things in hours. I want to fund a laboratory. Her voice carried the same crisp efficiency she brought to everything. A proper facility where you can work on mobility devices under Dr. Chen's supervision. Equipment, materials, staff, whatever you need. A place where what you did for Grace can become what you do for everyone who needs it. Jack stared at the documents, trying to process what he was seeing. The numbers alone were staggering. Equipment costs in the hundreds of thousands. Staffing budgets that exceeded his annual income several times over. A facility in San Diego's light industrial district that would cost more to lease for a year than his garage was worth entirely. This is too much. He set down the tablet. I can't accept this. You're not accepting charity. Victoria's voice sharpened. You're accepting an investment. I spent 11 years throwing money at the medical establishment trying to buy a solution for Grace's pain. You gave me that solution for the price of some modified parts and your time. This is me investing in the right approach instead of the wrong one. Grace leaned forward in her chair. Dad always told me to find something I was good at and then find a way to make it matter. She caught herself a shadow crossing her face. Before he left anyway, but the point stands. You're good at this, Jack. Really good. And there are thousands of people out there who need what you can do. Jack thought about all the messages that had flooded his phone over the past weeks. Parents desperate to help their children. Veterans abandoned by the system. People who had been told their whole lives that pain was just something they had to accept. I don't know how to run a laboratory. The objection sounded weak even to his own ears. I barely know how to run my garage. You won't be running it alone. Victoria pulled up another document. Dr. Chen has agreed to serve as Chief Scientific Officer. I'll handle the business side, the funding, the regulatory compliance. You'll do what you do best. See what others miss. Fix what others can't. And if it fails, if I can't actually help anyone else, if Grace was just a lucky fluke. Victoria was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than Jack had ever heard it. 11 years ago, I almost let my daughter drown because I was too focused on work to notice a riptide. She did not look at Grace as she said this, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that only she could see. Every day since then, I've tried to make up for that moment. Doctors, treatments, equipment, anything that might give her back what I took away. I spent millions. I flew her around the world. I did everything money could buy. She finally met Jack's eyes, and none of it worked. None of it even came close. Then you came along. A mechanic in a rundown garage with no credentials and no resources and nothing but your hands and your heart. And in 3 weeks, you gave her more than 11 years of experts ever could. Victoria reached out and put her hand on Jack's arm. If there are more people like you out there, people who can help when the system fails, I want to find them. I want to give them what they need to do what you did. And if that means spending every dollar I have building something new, then that's what I'll do. Because my daughter is walking. My daughter is running. My daughter is living her life instead of just surviving it. And that is worth any amount of money. Jack looked at Grace, who was watching this exchange with tears in her eyes. He thought about Lily, who had told him to be a hero. He thought about Michael, who had made him promise to never walk away. All right. The words came out before he could second guess himself. Let's build something. The next 6 months were a blur of activity that made Jack's previous life seem almost peaceful by comparison. Victoria purchased a building in San Diego's Kearny Mesa district, a former manufacturing facility with high ceilings and plenty of natural light. Dr. Chen flew down from Stanford every other week to oversee the setup, bringing with her expertise and connections that opened doors Jack never knew existed. They named it Sullivan Mobility Lab, though Jack argued unsuccessfully for something that did not include his name. Victoria insisted that his name carried weight now that people would trust a facility founded by the man who had helped Grace Thornton when no one else could. The equipment arrived in stages. Precision measurement tools that made Jack's old garage instruments look like children's toys. Computer systems capable of modeling joint mechanics and stress distribution in 3 dimensions. Materials testing apparatus that could simulate years of wear in a matter of days. A manufacturing area where Jack could fabricate custom components to exact specifications. Dr. Chen helped him understand the science behind what he had been doing intuitively. The biomechanics of human movement. The engineering principles that governed load distribution and joint articulation. The regulatory requirements that would allow their work to actually reach patients without running afoul of the FDA. You have remarkable instincts, she told him one afternoon, reviewing his notes from the Grace Project. You identified problems that our best graduate students would have missed, but instincts alone won't scale. We need to document everything, create protocols, build systems that others can follow. Jack found himself attending classes earning certifications he had never imagined pursuing. Biomedical engineering fundamentals, medical device safety protocols, quality management systems. The coursework was challenging, but he discovered that the same mind that could diagnose a failing transmission could also grasp the mechanics of human locomotion. Lily was his most enthusiastic supporter and his harshest critic. She would come to the lab after school, doing her homework in the corner, while her father worked occasionally wandering over to ask questions or point out things he had missed. You know, this is basically what I want to do when I grow up, she told him one evening, examining a prototype knee joint he was developing. Biomedical engineering, building things that help people. Jack felt something twist in his chest. his daughter following in footsteps he had never intended to leave. His daughter finding her calling in something that had started as a promise to a dying brother. Your mother would be proud. She'd be worried, Lily grinned. You know how she felt about you taking risks. This doesn't feel like a risk anymore. Jack took the joint back and held it up to the light, examining the precision machining. It feels like exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Grace became the lab's first official employee, taking on the role of patient coordinator. She had a gift for connecting with the families who came seeking help for explaining complex medical concepts in terms that anyone could understand. Her own journey gave her credibility that no credential could match. I know what you're going through, she would tell anxious parents or frustrated patients. I know how it feels to be in pain every day, to be told that nothing more can be done. But I also know that sometimes the answer isn't in a textbook or a medical journal. Sometimes it's in someone who's willing to look at your problem with fresh eyes. The first patients arrived within weeks of the lab opening. A 12-year-old boy named Tommy Rodriguez with cerebral palsy, whose leg braces caused pain similar to what Grace had experienced. A veteran named Bobby Hayes, who had given up on his prosthetic arm because it caused more problems than it solved. A college student named Sophia Martinez, whose wheelchair left her unable to sit through a full day of classes. Each case was different. Each required its own approach, its own modifications, its own careful testing and adjustment. But the underlying principle remained the same. Listen to the patient, understand how they actually moved, not how some theoretical model said they should move. Design solutions that worked with their bodies instead of against them. Tommy was the first success after Grace. His mother had driven 6 hours from Los Angeles after seeing Grace's story on the news. The braces he wore were too rigid, forcing his body into positions it could not comfortably maintain. Jack spent a week studying how Tommy moved, mapping the patterns of tension and compensation that had developed over years of living with equipment that did not fit. The modifications were different from what he had done for Grace. Tommy needed flexibility more than he needed lighter weight. His braces needed to allow for the natural variation in his movements, rather than trying to constrain them into some ideal form. When Tommy put on the modified braces for the first time and walked across the lab without wincing, his mother burst into tears. When he started running, playing with the other children at a nearby park like any normal 12-year-old, she hugged Jack so hard he thought she might crack his ribs. The doctors said he would always be in pain. Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. They said this was just how it was for kids like him. They said we should be grateful he could walk at all. Jack thought about Grace saying almost exactly the same words. About all the patients he had seen in the months since opening the lab, all of them carrying the same message from the medical establishment. Be grateful for what you have. Accept your limitations. Stop asking for more. They were wrong. Jack gently disengaged from her embrace. That's what we're proving here. That sometimes the experts are wrong. And when they are, someone needs to have the courage to try something different. Bobby Hayes was a harder case. His prosthetic arm had been state-of-the-art when he received it, a sophisticated piece of engineering that should have restored much of the function he had lost in combat. But something about the socket fit was wrong, causing chronic pain at the attachment point that had made wearing the device unbearable. Jack spent hours studying the prosthetic, trying to understand why it was failing. The engineering was sound. The materials were excellent. Everything about it should have worked. The answer came from Bobby himself during a conversation that had nothing to do with mechanics. "It feels wrong." Bobby was staring at the prosthetic lying on the workbench, his expression a mixture of frustration and grief. "Like it belongs to someone else. Like my body knows it's not really part of me and is trying to reject it." Jack understood then. The problem was not mechanical, it was psychological. The prosthetic had been designed to replace what Bobby had lost, to simulate a natural arm as closely as possible. But Bobby's body did not want a simulation. It wanted something that felt like an extension of himself, not a replacement for what was gone. He redesigned the socket interface with that understanding in mind. Instead of trying to hide the junction between flesh and machine, he emphasized it. Instead of simulating natural movement, he created something that moved in ways a natural arm never could. Instead of pretending that nothing had changed, he acknowledged that everything had. "It's not about making you forget what happened," Jack explained as Bobby tried the modified prosthetic for the first time. "It's about helping you live with it. About giving you something that feels like yours, instead of something that's pretending to be what you lost." Bobby wore the prosthetic home that day and did not take it off for a week. When he came back to the lab, he was grinning for the first time since Jack had met him. "I held my grandson yesterday." His voice cracked on the words. "First time in 3 years I've been able to hold anything without pain." The successes accumulated. Sophia's wheelchair was redesigned to support her body properly during long sitting sessions. A former dancer with a spinal injury received braces that allowed her to move with something approaching the grace she had once possessed. A construction worker whose knee replacement had left him unable to climb stairs got a modified joint that restored his ability to do the work he loved. With each success, more patients came. The lab's waiting list grew from weeks to months. Jack hired additional technicians, training them in his methods, trying to scale what he had learned into something that could help more than just the people who happened to find their way to his door. Dr. Chen's involvement proved invaluable. She helped Jack understand the science behind his intuitions, translating his observations into the language of peer-reviewed research. Together, they published papers documenting their approach, sharing their methods with other researchers and practitioners who wanted to learn. "You're changing the field." Dr. Chen told him one evening, reviewing the latest draft of a paper they were preparing for a major medical journal. "Not just by what you're doing, but by how you're doing it. You're proving that patient-centered design is not just a buzzword. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about mobility assistance." Jack was less certain. He was still just a mechanic, still learning the terminology and protocols that the medical establishment required. But he could not deny that something was changing. More doctors were referring patients to the lab. Medical device companies were reaching out, wanting to understand his approach. Students from engineering programs across the country were applying for internships. The NIH call came 8 months after the lab opened. A representative from the National Institutes of Health wanted to visit to see what they were doing and discuss potential funding for expanded research. "This could be massive, Dr." Chen was pacing her small office, barely able to contain her excitement. "Federal funding means legitimacy. It means we could expand, hire more people, help more patients. It means we could actually change how the industry approaches mobility devices." The NIH representatives arrived on a Tuesday morning. 3 people in business, casual, carrying tablets and notebooks, looking around the lab with expressions Jack could not quite read. They interviewed him, Dr. Chen and Grace. They examined case files, reviewed modifications, asked pointed questions about safety protocols and outcome measurements. After 4 hours, the lead representative, Dr. Patricia Flores, sat down with the core team. I'll be honest, this is unusual. We don't typically fund operations run by someone without traditional credentials. She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. But your outcomes are undeniable. The patient satisfaction data is extraordinary. And Dr. Chen's involvement gives us confidence in the scientific rigor. But, Jack heard the hesitation in her voice, but we need more documentation, formal studies comparing your modified devices to standard equipment, peer-reviewed publications, evidence that this approach works consistently across different patient populations. Dr. Flores paused again. If you can provide that, we're prepared to fund a 5-year study that could transform how mobility devices are designed and prescribed. The amount she mentioned made Jack's head spin. Enough to expand the lab, significantly hire additional staff, help hundreds or even thousands of people. But it also meant committing to the academic side of things, the research and publications and bureaucracy he had spent his whole life avoiding. Can we have some time to discuss it? Dr. Chen asked. Of course, take a week. But understand this opportunity won't come around again. The NIH is interested now because you're novel and getting attention. That window will close eventually. After the representatives left, Jack sat in his office and tried to process what had just happened. He had started with a promise to a dying brother, a garage full of old tools and hands that knew how to fix things. Now he was being offered federal funding to change an entire industry. Lily stopped by after school, finding him staring at the wall. Heavy thoughts. Life-changing thoughts. Jack shook his head slowly. The NIH wants to fund us. Serious money. Enough to really build something significant. That's amazing. Why do you look so worried? Because it means going all in on this. No more garage. No more just being a mechanic who helps people on the side. This would be my whole life. Lily sat on the edge of his desk, studying him with those 2 old eyes of hers. Dad, does this make you happy? Jack considered the question, not whether it was safe or smart or practical, whether it made him happy. Yeah, the word surprised him with its certainty. For the first time since your mom died, yeah, I think it does. Then do it. Lily smiled. Mom would want you to be happy. Uncle Michael would too. The decision was made that evening. They would accept the NIH funding commit to the formal research and build something that could actually change the industry. A year later, they held a celebration at the lab. Current and former patients came with their families, filling the space with people whose lives had been transformed by what happened within these walls. Tommy Rodriguez was there running around with other children, his braces barely noticeable. Bobby Hayes demonstrated his prosthetic arm by helping set up chairs moving with a natural ease that would have been impossible a year before. Sophia Martinez wheeled herself through the crowd, stopping to chat with everyone, her face bright with a joy that had been absent when she first arrived. Grace gave a speech that left half the room in tears. A year ago, I walked into a garage in pain. I'd been in pain for so long that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to not hurt. She paused, looking at Jack. Jack Sullivan looked at me, really looked at me, and saw something that everyone else had missed. He saw that my pain wasn't inevitable. It was fixable. She continued, her voice growing stronger. But what we've built here is about more than fixing braces or prosthetics. It's about fixing a system that forgot to put patients first. It's about proving that expertise isn't just about degrees. It's about caring enough to really listen. When Jack was asked to speak, he kept it brief. My brother once told me something I've never forgotten. He said the worst part of his situation wasn't the pain or the limitations. It was when people gave up on him. When they stopped trying to help because they decided nothing more could be done. He looked around the room at all the faces, all the lives his work had touched. I've tried not to give up on anyone who's come through these doors. Sometimes I've succeeded. Sometimes I haven't. But every day I wake up and try. That's all any of us can do. The celebration continued late into the evening. People shared stories, laughed, cried, connected through their common experience of suffering and healing. Jack eventually found himself outside, staring up at the California stars, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Victoria joined him after a while. "You've built something remarkable here." Her voice was quiet, reflective. "Something that's going to outlast all of us." "We built it." Jack glanced at her. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Perhaps." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "But I was just the money. You were the heart." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. "Grace wants to go back to the beach," Victoria said suddenly. "The one where she almost drowned. She says she needs to face it, to prove to herself that it doesn't define her anymore." "Do you think that's a good idea?" "I think my daughter has proven that she knows what she needs better than anyone else." Victoria smiled slightly. "And I think she wants you to be there. All of us. You, Lily, me. The people who helped her become who she is now." The trip to the beach was planned for the following Saturday. Jack, Lily, Victoria, and Grace drove together, the unlikely family they had become over the past year and a half. The beach was exactly as Victoria had described from her memories. Golden sand stretching toward the water, waves rolling in with endless patience. The California sun warming everything it touched. Grace stood at the edge of the parking lot, looking down at the water with an expression Jack could not quite read. "This is where it happened." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Where I went under and everything changed." She started walking toward the water, her modified braces carrying her with confidence across the sand. The rest of them followed at a distance, giving her space for whatever she needed to do. When Grace reached the water's edge, she stopped. For a long moment, she just stood there, waves lapping at her feet, staring out at the ocean that had almost claimed her life. "For years, I was so angry at this place." She spoke without turning around, knowing they could hear her. "Angry at the ocean, at myself for swimming out too far, at my body for breaking. I felt like the girl I was supposed to be died that day, and all that was left was this broken version who could never be whole again." She turned to face them, tears streaming down her face. But that girl didn't die. She survived. She fought through years of pain and limitation and people telling her to accept less than she deserved. And she grew up into someone who refuses to let the past define her future. Grace looked directly at Jack. "You helped me remember that I'm not just my injury or my limitations. I'm a person with dreams and the right to pursue them. You gave me back my life." Then, before anyone could react, Grace kicked off her shoes, unfastened her braces with practiced efficiency, and walked into the water. Just her feet at first, then her ankles, then deeper, until the waves lapped at her calves. She stood there with her arms spread wide, face turned toward the sun, laughing with pure joy. Victoria gasped, moving forward instinctively, but Jack caught her arm. Let her have this moment. She's okay. Grace was okay. More than okay. She was free, standing in the water that had nearly killed her, proving that the past did not have to be destiny. When she finally came back to shore, everyone was crying. She hugged her mother first, both of them laughing through their tears. Then she hugged Jack, holding tight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for seeing me, for not giving up, for helping me find my way back to myself. You did the hard work." Jack's voice was rough with emotion. "I just adjusted some angles and replaced some parts. You're the one who had the courage to keep fighting." They spent the rest of the morning at the beach, talking and walking and watching Lily build elaborate sandcastles with engineering precision. It was peaceful, healing, a moment of quiet triumph after everything they had been through. On the drive home, Victoria reached over and took Jack's hand. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. They were two people who had lost everything and found something unexpected in the wreckage. Not a replacement for what was gone, but something new. Something that might, with time and care, become its own kind of beautiful. That night, Jack dreamed of Michael. Not the sick Michael from those final weeks, but his brother as he had been before the accident. Strong and whole and grinning. "You did good, little brother," Dream Michael said. "You kept your promise." Jack woke with tears on his face and peace in his heart. The lab continued to grow in the months that followed. The NIH funding came through, allowing them to expand into adjacent space higher. More technicians help more patients. Dr. Chen's research gained recognition, leading to invitations to speak at conferences around the world. Grace became a national advocate for patient-centered design, her story inspiring others to demand better from the medical establishment. Lily finished her freshman year with straight A's and a clear plan for her future. Biomedical engineering at Stanford, where Dr. Chen had already promised to mentor her. The next generation carrying forward what her father and uncle had started. And Jack kept doing what he had always done, listening to patients, seeing what others missed, fixing things that everyone else had given up on. One morning, about 2 years after that first Rolls-Royce had pulled into his garage, Jack received a text from Dr. Chen. "NIH just approved full 5-year funding. We're official. Time to change the world." He smiled, reading the message twice. 2 years ago, he had been a mechanic in a struggling garage going through the motions of life without really living. Now he was leading a movement that might actually change an entire industry. All because a coolant hose had burst on a hot Thursday afternoon. All because a girl in pain had looked at him and asked for help. All because a dying brother had made him promise to never look away. "All right, Michael," Jack whispered to the empty air. "We're still going." And somewhere he knew his brother was smiling. One step at a time, one patient at a time, one promise kept.